kind introduction, and you all recognize that it's all downhill from here, right? So, is it going to help if I use this or not, or?
You sound great.
Okay, is it going to be all right for whatever is happening there? Okay, well, we'll try it without, and if I get overcome with emotion and my voice gives out or whatever, we'll try something else. Renee said something that was very true, which is I am more interested in you all than I am. I've been very fortunate to be a bystander in some of the greatest things that have accomplished in our field over about a 70-year period, and it's just really been something. And you all, this is the best time in history to be alive, except for tomorrow. And you all are likely to have a few more of those tomorrows than I do. So I really envy you, and I want to kind of give you some encouragement as we go on. But I want to start with a disclaimer. And that's a quote from a guy named Darwin. This quote appeared in a book by Paulman and Newton on general atmospheric circulation systems. That was where I saw it. He basically said, hey, don't inflict false facts on the world, but if you have false ideas, they don't cause much harm because everybody takes a lot of delight in proving them wrong. And I sort of feel that an after-dinner talk, it's more important to be stimulating than right. And so also want you all to shout out in that spirit when I've been overstimulated and wrong and so on. Raise your hand and make a comment or bring me up short or share your wisdom with the group, and let's try to have a little bit of co-production of knowledge. We had this excellent meal, and it reminds me of something that is very special about my wife. People who host dinners fall into two categories. One is you're hosting a dinner and you only go with the tried and true recipe. How many of you are in that category? I got a few hands. My wife is in the other category. Hey, it's a new group, let's experiment. Let's try a recipe that we've never tried before. And that's kind of what this talk is. There'll be a few things that people like Keith and others recognize, but there's a lot of new stuff in here as well, and I'm trying it out on you all, and so I'm looking for comments. So a keynote talk ought to recognize the musical score where you're trying to provide the keynote, and this is what Derek says you all are going to do during this week. And the reason you're here is that you're going to get thinking about your individual research and think a little bit more strategically about how you can help different end users and decision makers, and also how to communicate this research to others. So we're going to kind of unpack those themes. And we're going to start with this quote. This is from Mark Twain. The two most important days in your life, the day you're born and the day you find out why. And so I think going back to that question about, as researchers, how do I make contact with end users? How do I make contact with decision makers? How do I communicate with people I want to understand what I'm doing? It all starts with why you and I are doing that. And we're going to keep coming back to that throughout this talk, and we're going to actually wrap up with this idea. How many of you have heard the story of the 3 stonecutters? Oh boy, a lot of shaking heads. This amazes me. Okay, so 3 stonecutters, and bystander says, what are you doing? And the first stonecutter says, I'm making a living for my family. The second says, I'm the best stonecutter you'll ever find. In the whole country here, I'm the best one. And the third one says, I'm building a cathedral, a monument to God. So a key part of understanding what we're going to communicate or what's important about our research is why we're doing it. And one trap that's very easy to fall into in the 21st century is the second trap. The second trap says, I want to be the best at my research. I want it to be cutting edge. That's the only thing that matters. And in a way, that was true of most of the scientists of my generation. I would call my generation scientists 3.0. So scientists version 1.0 were people like Aristotle and Galen the physician, and Aristotle said things like, porcupines shoot their quills. And Galen said things like, the function of the heart is to heat the body. All right? Then we had version 2.0, that was Galileo and Newton, and so you had a little mathematics and you had some experiments. And version 3.0 are pale stale males like me. They became scientists shortly after World War II, and the idea was, give us the social contract, give us lots of money, don't ask too many questions, and someday you'll be glad you did. All right. You all are version 4.0. Life is a little more urgent now, and you all have social skills built in. With my generation, social skills were something you had to patch on, and you're just operating in a different way. So you see science as a means to an end. The generation I come from said, oh, we have curiosity-driven research, we have basic research, just the crumbs from the table of all that basic investigation will be worth society's while. So ask yourself these questions. Are you working just to earn a living? Are you working because you want to nourish your individual branding? Or are you working because you have some bigger picture in mind? So some of you might be in the business of understanding climate change. Some of you might be in sort of a fuller business of looking at climate change and variability. Then there's the group thinking about helping society make decisions and take action. That's what Derek covered in his profile there. But there's another category we're going to talk about, and that's a category that's a little bigger still. So, and this comes to sort of the first of several radical statements that people might not agree with, and this is overstepping quite a bit. But you could argue that climate change, as we normally talk about it, particularly global warming, is a symptom of something else. So my mother and I had the climate change argument when I was in seventh grade, and we were living in Princeton, New Jersey, where Keith Dixon lives. And the discussion, the climate change discussion, went something like this. I was a sickly kid. I would miss the order of 50 days of school a year with different respiratory infections and stuff. Fortunately, school wasn't too hard, and I was keeping up, but it was grade school. And my mother would come into the room like this, and she'd be just about as far from me as I am from Jorge, and she would say, "You have a fever," okay? And I would say, "I do not." Okay, and that's the climate change argument in a nutshell. And my mother was the scientist, and she was saying that because she could see I was flushed, and she was thinking there were more serious problems underlying that temperature. And I said no, not because I wasn't feeling flushed, and not because I didn't know I had a temperature, but I knew that it was the first day of Little League baseball practice. And if I had a fever, I wasn't going to get to go. And so that, in a nutshell, is the climate change argument today. But the underlying problem that my mother saw, the underlying problem that scientists see, is it's not just about global warming. It's certainly about fossil fuels and emissions and all the rest of it. But it's this whole host of impacts, and it's a whole host of impacts that have nothing to do with carbon emissions. It has to do with 7 billion people trampling over the landscape, modifying things. And underlying this, there's this change in our situation. For all of human experience, we had a twofold problem. Earth is a resource, and Earth is a threat. So you see these folks in the downhill from the volcano, and they're discovering that fire might have some utility. But in a short period of time in recent years, everything has changed. So we see that there's been this rapid population growth, a factor of 3 just in the last 100 years or so. But not only that, there's been the same kind of increase in our per capita use of resources. So we need about 4 gallons of water a day for our personal use, but we're using on average, everybody in this room, 400 gallons of water a day for all the energy production and food production and so on that's making our lifestyle possible. There's also a similarly rapid change in technology and the rapid change in the way we live. And all of this success has changed the twofold problem, the only one that we were used to, into a threefold problem. Earth as a resource, Earth as a threat, and now Earth as a victim. This human success, I said, is rapid onset. It occurred in the time short compared with the scale of just a couple of human lifetimes, but also with regard to the time scale for climate variability, for the recurrence of extreme events, or the emergence of the unintended consequences of that success. We're looking, when we see these pollution events and problems with groundwater and, biochemicals in the drinking water and all the rest of that, we're looking at things that were the result of activities that we started 30, 50 years ago. The things we're doing today are going to be peppering our daily news in the life ahead. We have no idea whether we'll be able to keep up this pace of progress for another 100 years, or 50, or 1,000. And finally, we have not, as individuals or as the human race, internalized the change in our situation. We're intellectually aware of it, but we haven't taken it to heart. And the result of this is we can expect the future. There's a forecast for the next 100 years. Whatever the climate does, we're not going to like it because we've tuned our success to a very narrow range of climate variables over the last 100 years or so. We're going to see natural extremes that go outside the boundaries of what we've come to expect from these very brief 100 and 200-year records. We're going to pick up the newspapers or look on our Kindle and or whatever device of the future supplants those two things, and just see a succession of environmental catastrophes that are occurring almost like the whack-a-mole kinds of things that you do at the amusement park, just as fast as we can cope with them. We're going to find our world is always characterized by declining margins and shortages of critical items. And finally, we're going to discover that top-down command and control approaches to solving these problems are always behind the curve, because the thinking of the people at the top of the heap is lagging the nature of the problem. That's what we've got to deal with. So we've got a set of serious problems, unprecedented in their nature and likely to impact us fairly seriously. We've got to solve them. We've got to solve them in time. And since we don't have all the riches in the world, we've got to do this cheaply. Furthermore, remember the equations that we all learned starting in middle school, the ones that we're still friendly with, but most of our classmates kind of dropped out at that point? These are equations that we have to solve simultaneously. We can't deal with Earth as a resource on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and Earth as a hazard on Tuesday and Thursday, and try to protect the Earth on Saturday and pray on Sunday. We just can't do it that way. We've got to solve these problems simultaneously, locally, globally, and for all times. The real world, though, suggests that we can only pick one or two of these issues to deal with at one time. This is a landslide at the Bingham Canyon open pit mine in Utah. It was the largest landslide ever to occur in recorded history in Northern America. It displaced enough earth to cover Central Park in New York 60 feet deep. Okay, I mean, it caused seismic activity that was detectable for quite some distance. And so it was an effort to deal with Earth as a resource that created a problem, Earth as a hazard. And you can just look at the scarred landscape and the scale of it and realize that we had trouble with the protection part. So there's a lot of apocalyptic literature out there. These happen to be fiction, but you can do the same for nonfiction. So now that I see all these solemn faces here, I want to take a poll of the group. I want to get just a little sip of water here first. So I want to find out which way you lean. First I want to see a show of hands of all those who think that the 21st century we're going to fight these problems, but we're in a decline. Wow. Okay, so that means everybody's in the second group. Everyone thinks that the 21st century will be humankind's best century ever. How many people think that? Some people are abstaining. Okay, talk, you people who didn't raise your hand, talk to me a little bit. Why did you think this was such an idiotic question to ask?
There's a medium ground between the two.
Which looks like what?
So we do some things well and some things badly.
Yeah. Do we get a do-over on the things we do badly? Is entropy our friend? Okay. Who else didn't have their hand up? Yeah.
I didn't know what the two options were, and I wasn't going to dig till I knew what the two options were. I lean towards number one.
Number one. Okay. Any other comments on one or two, or why you chose Keith? Yeah.
So on the mankind's part, they're talking integrated around the globe. But if
Yeah,
there's winners and losers and different people will have different reckoning, then
Right.
it doesn't fit so cleanly.
Yeah, that's one of the things that's happening in this country. I think we have a balance of payments problem in the economy, but we're exporting environmental problems far more than we're importing them. And so we look around our own environment and it looks better than it might. Okay, all of you who thought that 21st century will be mankind's best century yet, you're not off the hook. I now want to hear from you why you think that. What's your reason for thinking that's realistic?
It's the hope part, and we just want to hope.
We're scientists here. Where did this hope stuff come from? You know, what's the hope in being delusional? You know, it ought to be sort of evidence-based somehow. Talk to me about that part. Who's going to help her out? Yeah.
It just seems like there's way more evidence that it is a real thing, that maybe people will finally respond.
Oh, okay. That's not bad. Yeah, okay. So building awareness? Yeah. Okay, that's good.
I said that because I'm an internal optimist, and I just feel like every time I work with people, young people in this room, they always have these great ideas, and I just feel like they will make a better world for themselves.
All right, that's getting very warm to the thesis of the rest of the talk. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to leave it at there. I'm going to give you some rest. So I'm going to argue for a few minutes here that there are 4 tools that sort of show the way out. And these are tools. One of the things that happened the whole time I was in NOAA, which was from 1967, before it was called NOAA, it was called ESSA then. Came at NOAA in 1970, all the way through 2000. Everybody in NOAA was saying, we're getting these massive data streams. We aren't investing enough in archiving these data. Storage of the data is lagging behind. You know, there's no way we're going to be able to keep all this stuff and so on. That's because they were constantly trying to solve the future data problem with the past data technology. And that's a symptom of a more general kind of approach to these things. So these 4 tools have special reach. They've always been around, but they have special reach in the 21st century. And they promise, I think, to show the way out. And in fact, if you look at news media with this kind of bias in mind, you'll see all kinds of evidence every day, signs that people are beginning to wheel these tools up to the real world problems we've been talking about. So let's tackle the basis of facts. Over this same couple of 100-year period where humanity has achieved such a big success, we completely transformed our thinking about how the Earth works. The start of this period, everybody thought, and they had thought for hundreds of thousands of years, the assimilative capacity of the atmosphere is infinite, the climate never changes, and weather is unpredictable. And basically, the science of the past century or so turned all those things around, not just on local and regional scales, but on global scales. The assimilative capacity of the atmosphere is finite. Actually, obviously, what happened there is as we produced more stuff for the atmosphere to assimilate, we kind of saw the flaw in that reasoning. Climate is variable, sometimes abruptly. Weather is more predictable than we thought. We didn't just tweak the understanding of 100,000 or 200,000 years. We utterly stood it on its head. And that's thanks to 100 years of Earth observation, science, and services. We've made this progress by spending less than 0.1% of world GDP on this subject. So we're currently spending globally something like 40 billion a year. It might be twice that, it might be half that. It's not half that, but it's something in that range, but it's not 10 times that. And this is out of a 60, now 70 or greater trillion a year economy. And we haven't run out of ideas, as this slide shows. So you see these satellites about the size of a brick, you know, these nano satellites. You see the launching capability to the right. You see the phased array radar that's being developed here at Norman, Oklahoma, and so on. Lots of new ideas. Okay, so let's tackle the second piece of this. It's great to know how the Earth works. It's great to be sort of uncovering how that working goes on globally and also locally for short periods over the long haul and so on. But it doesn't do us any good unless we sort of transform that into action. You're going to be hearing from Kelvin Drogemeyer and others later in the week about policy and how policy plays into this. But I'm thinking this is a group with an IQs in 3 digits, so you all have an idea of what policy is. And you're just eager on night number 1 to sort of be vulnerable and share with me or share with the group your answer to that. Right? Yeah, who said yes? Yes, sir. Fire away.
No, I don't. Yeah. The question is about policy.
What is it?
Regional.
Tell me more.
I'm from Texas.
Yeah.
I can't say any more than that.
Yeah. All right, what is policy? Just a simple idea. What is it? Wow. Okay. You should all take the colloquium. So Webster says it's a definite course or method of action selected from among alternatives in light of given conditions to guide and determine present and future decisions. It's a framework. Policies are a framework for making decisions. So when we leave tonight, if we're going someplace by car, we don't invent from first principles whether we should drive on the right-hand side of the road. Okay? We do that because it's the state's policy, probably even the policy in Texas. Most of the time, right, most of the time. And we've got other policies about driving and everything we do in life. And it's an intelligence multiplier. So it's the kind of thing that you do if you're trying to simplify your decision. So for example, the Constitution's only mention of science is this one line: Congress shall have the power to promote the progress of science and the useful arts. And then you notice that a couple hundred years later, when NSF gets set up, they try to pick up that same language. They want to tie it back to the Constitution, and they make some other policies. They could have decided that all scientists will work for a federal agency called NSF, and they said, no, that's not the best way to do it. We want to fund people at universities through grants and contracts and so on. We want to award graduate fellowships. We'd like to do some international things. That's policy. Policies create emergent behavior. They're the way that dumb things like human beings deal with complicated problems like climate change. And to give you an example, we are tempted to think that we can comprehend that problem all on our own, but it turns out it's just far more far-reaching than that. So look at this anthill that's about 10 feet high or 15 feet high or so in this picture. It's nearly perfect for the ants. It's solved this threefold problem of resources, threats, and environmental protection that I've talked about. It's got HVAC, and so the temperature and humidity within the anthill is just perfect for the ants. Food can come in, but predators can't. Water can come in, but predators can't. Waste can go out. It's all taken care of in this anthill. But there's no ant you can accuse of having the big picture. They are all making all of the decisions that lead to the creation of this and the maintenance of it through policies. And those policies usually take the form of chemical signals that they send each other. There's just very simple coding that when you multiply it by ants, and here's something you can remember for the next cocktail party you're at the weight of the ants in the world is about the weight of human beings. Okay, so they weigh about as much as the 7 billion of us. Behavior at night or schooling of fish. You know, how do they do that? How do those bird-brained creatures do that? Well, some guy has, a guy from New York, a guy from Brooklyn, programmed this up. You can see it in the lower left-hand part of this figure. According to 3 rules, he created little computerized critters called boids. And they maintain separation from each other. When you're flying, you don't want to collide with your neighbor. You try to match speeds and velocity. And you always try to fly towards the center of the group. There's no one bird that's in charge. If you relax any one of these rules, you don't get the swarming behavior. You get something else. And so I want to invite you now to look at 2 sets of policy options. These are not realistic, but I've sort of got a policy option 1 and a policy option 2, trying to look at Earth as a resource. Policy option 1 says resources are limited. We kind of want to use armed might and sort of control as much of resources as we can, and so we'll have them to consume. Policy option 2 said let's innovate. Let's create resources. When it comes to the environment, you can sort of have the oops policy. You damage things inadvertently and you try to restore them, or you can be cognizant as you're going along and do your best to preserve them. When it comes to hazards, you can try to make extremes irrelevant by building levees and other sort of hard solutions, or you can try to use soft measures to build community resilience to hazards. Paulette will probably tell you a lot in the middle of the week about how indigenous people do the latter. When it comes to the 3 problems taken together, you can try to solve each of them in isolation and also artificially at the same time try to be exact about that. Or you can say we're going to be kind of clumsy and approximate, but we will make an effort to try to deal with the threefold problem all at once. In policy 1, you can decide we compete with each other. We might collaborate doing scientific experiments, but when nations really get at it, they compete with each other. Or you could decide that nations collaborate and compete in the experiments. My dad was a mathematician. He used to say that if the Greeks and Arabs had been in communication with each other, would have either plane geometry or algebra, but not both. Okay, so there's a real advantage to having a diversity of experimentation, but looking at the winners and innovating. So what kind of world do you think we'll get if we use the policies on the left? Yeah, see a few raised eyebrows. That goes back to the pessimists in the crowd. That's sort of saying, you can imagine if we pursue that set of policies or something like it that has those elements, we will engage in a sort of downward spiral. If we try to move ourselves a little bit to the right, it's not clear we'll be successful, but it might be, it sort of look, because these properties are emergent, right? We're not smart enough to see where they lead, but you have to sort of try them out and see where you'll get going. So, since we don't know what policies are right, and since we don't have the 100 million years that were available to the ants to get their policy right, since we've got more like 100 years, we have to find some way to make policy more adaptive. And that comes back to John's comment about policy. You want policies that are local, and you want to experiment, and you want to use this tool called social networking to do something a little more substantive than say, yo, I'm at Starbucks, is anybody nearby? And say something a little more like, hey, we tried this mix of policies here in Albany, and this part worked well, and that part didn't. And then the folks in New Haven, Connecticut say, well, we might try something slightly different, or the people in California might be saying, that doesn't apply to us, and so on. We need to get more intentional and more disciplined in using this technology. Here's an example. It's not just about sharing information geographically. It's about sharing information and discipline. So another question for the group. Why is it, this is a 50-year curve of losses due to disasters, and inflation has been taken out of this curve. So we have 1950 or so over here, and we have 2000 or so over here. Why does that, it's noisy year to year, disasters vary. Why does that curve look like that?
Generations coming in.
Generations coming in.
More attractive to live on a beach.
Yeah, more people live on a beach. More property exposure. All of those things. Those are the standard answers. But there's some other things that work. The social scientists say, maybe we just haven't learned as much about hazards as we think. Maybe the knowledge is available but unused, and so on. Here's an example from another universe. Okay, this is aviation. So during the same 50 years when losses due to natural hazards are rising like this, the number of crashes per takeoff in aviation are doing this. And so the mean has been more or less constant, even slightly decreasing, even though there are 10 times as many flights today. That's tied up with learning from experience. After the flood, the teary-eyed couple says beside the house, this was grandfather's house, we're going to rebuild it like before. And after the plane crash, suppose the wing falls off the plane. Suppose the NTSB was out there saying, the wing fell off this plane, but we're going to rebuild it like before. We'd all be taking the train everywhere we went. And that's what they decided at the beginning of this period. They said to themselves, the people in aviation said, you know, we're the safest form of transportation there is in 1960. But with 10 times the traffic, we're going to have a major plane crash once a week by 2014. And they said, we can't live with that. People, the traveling public won't live with that. We have got to get better every year. So if they were just to communicate that to their colleagues doing natural disasters, if we were to get serious about learning from experience in natural disasters, think how well we could do it. Okay, local level leaders. The idea here is if top-down command and control doesn't work. And I'll tell you a story. People think this is a recent phenomenon. This book, The End of Power, just came out a year or so ago. But Truman said this just before Eisenhower came into the White House. Truman called the reporters into the Oval Office and he said, Ike is going to come in here and he's going to say, do this and do that. And nothing is going to happen. It's not like the Army. And that's what every president since then has found. The president is like the queen ant in that anthill we were considering. He lives in a bubble. Pretty soon she lives in a bubble. You know, but the president lives in this bubble. There's a few people right at the table. This is the Oval Office huddle. Okay, you know, let me get that name, Pradeep. Yeah, go out and do this, and Emma, go do that, and so on. And I'm going to say, the president's going to say those things, and nothing is going to really penetrate outside that office. You want the action to go down locally, and the example here, it says, think like the Coast Guard, not like the Army. What is that about? So here's Katrina, New Orleans after Katrina. The guy in the picture is, no takers, Thad Allen. He was the commandant of the Coast Guard at that time. And I got to be in the back benches of a meeting that was about like this. So there was a meeting at the academy with all the people who knew something at the head table with Allen. And then there were some of us on the back benches who were in the room. And what that Allen said was just a tiny bit self-serving, but it went like this. He said, the reason the Army struggles in an event like Katrina is the Pentagon tells them to deploy. They go down to New Orleans, and as soon as they deploy, they call up the Pentagon and ask what they should do next. And as soon as they do that, they call up the Pentagon and ask what they should do next. He said, in the Coast Guard, it's just the opposite. Our officers use up all the resources they have on the ground. And when they need more resources, they turn to the headquarters and say, you need to send us more resources. He says the decision and the authority and so on is all on the ground where the action is. Now, that was Washington. This has to be a tiny bit self-serving, but that's the contrast that we want to have in our mind. So to recap, there are these four sort of 21st century tools: basis of facts, policy, IT and social networking, local leadership. You all have the chance and the responsibility to learn more about all these tools. You're already, you wouldn't be here if you weren't already using one or more of them. So continue using them, master them, improve them, partner with others in this effort. One of the things that's pretty clear is that only 24 hours in a day, and we need 8 of them for rest. So you're already finding that your faculty have more than enough courses for you to either take or teach at your university. To be a success in multidisciplinary efforts is going to require partnering. That, by the way, is going to require trust. I don't have time to really go into this, but one of the things about trust that's very important is we tend to think a lot about people who let us down, people who we found were untrustworthy, and get grumpy, because they created a hardship for us in one way or another. And the 21st century has to be about being trustworthy ourselves, recognizing that, even though we may not be able to count on others, we want them to be able to count on us, try to let them down the minimum possible, and try to give trust. Okay, so coming back to Mark Twain and this quote, 2-minute close, try to finish this up in 2 minutes. One thing that's very important for all of us to understand is if we listen to the story of how you got the job that you're in right now, why you're taking the subjects that you're taking right now, why you're teaching those that you're teaching right now, why you're sitting in this room, you find out that you were called to this rather than driven. Most of us respond to a message the world gives us that says, you really need to struggle to make a living in this world because the world wants to deny you that living. That's not what's happening. You all have already done a great job with your first and most important decision, which was your choice of parents. Okay, let that sink in. So there was geography associated with that choice, DNA associated with that choice, economic position associated with that choice, cultural traditions associated with that choice. All of them work in this magical way to give you and me an easy ride to this room. That process is continuing, okay? We have a chance to reflect on the fact that we're called. The word, by the way, is vocation, right? Vocation, which means call. It's related to vocal. You hear a lot about being a go-getter. I'm going to tell you about my favorite commencement speech of all time, which was for my stepson's high school graduation in the early 1980s. We were living in Boulder at that time. The speaker was a hippie. He lived in the hills above Boulder, and he and his hippie friends would go through the alpine meadows up there, and they'd take scissors and they'd cut weeds and flowers, and they'd put them in boiling water, and they'd drink it. And he founded Celestial Seasonings Tea Company. He was a millionaire many times over when he talked to the students. All those sleepy time teas and all the rest of that stuff, they came from his hippie experiments, in the alpine meadows. And so he said to the young people, he said this. He said, you hear a lot about being a go-getter. He said, I'm here to tell you to be a go-giver. As long as you have something to offer the world, you will never go hungry. And if you remember nothing else I said this evening, try to remember that statement. Okay. again, the world has all kinds of invitations for you to think about reasons why your life is somehow going to go totally belly up, and you're not going to be able to put that next meal on the table or buy that next tank of gas for the car or whatever. Don't buy into that. Next one is sort of find a mentor. Everything you hear says that today. And I want to suggest again that the opposite is true. You want to be a mentor to somebody else. In fact, my guess is that most of you are already doing that, probably all of you in one form or another. You're not giving yourself enough credit for that, and you're also not being intentional about that enough as you sort of wake up each morning and think, if you're going to be a go-giver, what better way than to be encouraging from the get-go to the people around you? And that'll make an enormous difference on how things go in this world. You're going to hear a lot about communication this week. And one of the things that most people in communication will emphasize is how important it is to be clear and kind of stick on message and all the rest of that. I want to suggest that the starting point for communication begins with listening. And once and only after you and I have been able to understand the person or the people or the community or the organization that we're with, can we then start to seek to be understood. And I think this next point is extremely important here as well. We just came, Renee mentioned the AMS Summer Policy Colloquium. We had some communication people there who sort of were suggesting that communication on issues like climate change is almost a form of combat, that scientists need to just, get more strident with their message and all the rest of it. Let me explain the demographics of Washington. There are 15,000 members of the American Meteorological Society. The society has about $15 million of unrestricted net assets. There are about 60,000 members of AGU, much bigger. They have about $30 million of unrestricted net assets. AARP, card-carrying member, folks, 1 million members in the state of Virginia. Okay, 1 million members in the state of Virginia, $3 billion in unrestricted net assets, and a terrific record of voting. High percentage of AARP people vote. So they say, oh, who yells the loudest? That sounds like a great contest to have. And somehow when it comes to earth sciences, our issue ought not to be, let's see if we can yell louder than the deniers or yell louder than this or that group that's struggling to gain the attention of Washington. Let's see if we can lower our voice and say things that make so much sense. Say things that, say something so profound about our character and our nature that people will listen to us. Now you may think that you don't know how to do this, but how many of you have a significant other in your life, or a husband or a wife or a partner of some kind? Okay, a lot of hands go up. There was a time in that first meeting where somehow for 30 seconds or 60 seconds or 30 minutes, you got all this together. You listened first. You communicated, the thing you communicated to that other person was not, I do atmospheric dynamics or I do climate or something. It was, you are very important to me. What you think matters to me. I can hardly wait to hear how you got here. It's those things and any kind of integrity or genuineness to it. That's what people respond to. Our problem in communication is we don't care enough about the people we're trying to communicate with. We're trying to take shortcuts with them and sort of, a quick, sort of superficial, something that might look like we care, and then getting on to what we really care about, which is getting X or Y out of them. So think about courtship. And how many of you have heard this expression from Mahatma Gandhi? Be the change you want to see in the world. Great. Okay, so drag that out, make that a part of your lexicon. Here's a quote that's 400 years older than that. It's by a guy who was a natural philosopher, a guy named Francis Bacon. That was their word for scientists. And here's what he said. This is going back to Our question about how do we communicate our research, it depends on what our research, why we're motivated to do that research in the first place. And here's what he said about the different motivations. He said, consider what are the true ends of knowledge. Don't seek it just because it's fascinating to sort of learn how things work. Don't do it for making yourself more successful in arguments, the contention part, or feeling superior to people who know less about that subject than you do, or to get rich, or famous, or powerful. But do it for the benefit and use of life. This is long before NSF had broader impacts in its proposal writing. It's long before somebody decided we should get in touch with end users and decision makers. And he says this, it was from the lust of power that the angels fell, from the lust of knowledge that men fell, but of charity, which was that Elizabethan word for love. There's no excess. Angels nor men ever came in danger by it. Thank you very much. So I urge you to have questions throughout. And it was a dry hole. And I know this is a bright group. And I know everything I said wasn't perfect. So either you're incredibly polite and gentle, and you thought, I'd talk to this bozo and correct the error of his ways, but it would be a waste of my time. Or else you were just feeling something else, like I can't wait to leave this room and hit the sack. No questions? Come on. Yeah. Good for you. You came in late, but you saved the day for us up here.
So do you think that the 4 tools that you mentioned will be able to address internationally the issues that are coming down to impact?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So science is inherently international, and that's one of the things about our science. So I think Derek might have said something about talking about your personal life here. So 10 seconds on that. When I was in 9th grade, I had a science book that said, scientists are a community of scholars engaged in a common search for knowledge. And I went to college, and then I went to the University of Chicago for graduate school, and I started out in physics. I was in the Institute for the Study of Metals. And there was no community of scientists. It was dog eat dog. The science that we were doing had been kind of plowed over, and people weren't sharing their results. I had one faculty member, we were trying to grow very pure crystals that were free from dislocations. I was building vacuum systems, banging Unistrut into walls and stuff. And our faculty advisor said, it took me 18 months to grow this crystal. I'm darned if I'll show anybody how I've done it until I've milked it for all it's worth. And I started looking for something else to do, and I went across the campus, and here were these folks who called themselves geophysical scientists. And they had more than enough problems to go around. Nobody was going to get rich. Nobody understood anything. And it was like walking into the sunlight. I had an advisor. I was waiting to hear about Unistrut and so on. He did a lot of theory. I thought I'd be coding. And for 3 weeks, he didn't say anything to me. And I went up to him and I said, what do you want me to do? And he said, I'm happy to support you, but I don't want to spend my time trying to keep you occupied. Wow! So I actually got to learn a little geophysical sciences and stuff, and I actually graduated. Otherwise, I'd still be back there, kind of hearing that all of you got to travel here to Norman and feeling jealous. So the science part is international. I mean, it's just inherently international. You can't predict today's weather in Norman, or weather a week from today here in Norman if you don't know what's happening over Siberia and so on. We're all in it together as far as the resources go, too. If you want to see that, just look at what the Defense Department is studying. They are all about water resources and food shortages and what it is that's going to cause mass migrations of displaced people globally and lead to international conflict and so on. So everybody understands that these problems know no borders and all the rest of it. And one of the things you see, it sort of looks like all the negotiations on carbon emissions and so on are breaking down, but in fact something wonderful is happening, sort of happening like fundraising to build a church or a synagogue. So in that circumstance, I don't come along and I don't say to, I'll have your name Pradeep by the end of the evening, Pradeep or to Brent, you got to give the same amount or else we don't want your money. I just say, Pradeep, whatever you can give, Brent, whatever you can give, Emma, do your best. And so you cobble it together. That's what's happening with international contributions to reducing fossil emissions. So I think internationally, we're going to be able to solve that problem. I maybe left on that part of your question versus what you really wanted to ask, but thank you. You were so gracious. Other questions or comments? Yes, sir, the photographer. Yeah.
How would you have answered the first question you asked about is it going down or are we going to solve this properly?
So I think, so I'm of two minds. There's a very famous philosophical discussion that goes by the title of Bertrand Russell's Chicken. Have you ever heard this discussion? Yeah, our Renaissance man over here is nodding. So the idea is that the chicken is reasoning by induction. The farmer hasn't come out and wrung her neck, the last 100 days, so he's not going to do it on day 101. But in fact, little does she know that her days as an egg layer are over. They're sort of ending, and he's getting closer to the day that she's going to wind up in the stew pot. So the signs are that every century has at least led to improved human conditions. The environment is another, is a sort of trickier issue. But human conditions are tied to the environment. And I actually think, who was the person, you talked about awareness, that awareness is the start, it's step one to this process, and it's underway. And again, for the last several years, since I started writing this book and so on, I've been seeing what I consider to be signs of this. Let me just mention another analogy that's very strong in my reasoning. There was a guy named Thomson who became Lord Kelvin. He was such a famous physicist. And around 1900, he gave a lecture when he said, all of physics is a solved problem. All it is now is a question of making better measurements. And he supposedly also said that there were just two small clouds on the horizon. And meteorologists love this, right? So one cloud was the photoelectric effect, and the other small cloud was the Michelson-Morley experiment. And meteorologists would say, well, at least he picked the clouds that turned out to be cumulonimbus in the 21st century. So one of them was quantum mechanics, and the other one was relativity theory. And so, there were signs of that in 1900. Those things were kind of known. And I sort of thought, if you look at the outside world, what can you see underway that would make a difference? And so that was what, I sort of zeroed in on those four things. Somebody else could have a better four things, or six things, or three, or something. But something like that, these emergent things will change the century faster than most of us think. Now, if you have more questions, I'm happy to answer them. But I also would like to offer a trade. I would like to try to show you, if you're interested or willing, is it okay to try this now?
Yeah, 30 minutes.
A 12-minute TED video. Paulette has seen this. She's the only other person in the room, I think, who's seen it. And we'll give it the Paulette test. So Paulette, if you say better if they watch it on their own, we'll all leave early. But if you think it would be useful to them, we'll show
I
it.
think it's a great video. I think it'd be worth watching.
What do you say? We'll sort of leave the deal that you can walk out and protest, you can see it on your own, you can get an early start, but we're going to try to see if we can make it happen. And let's see if okay, that's the end. Let's see move forward. And remember I was saying during the talk that we're all taught to find a mentor. But what you need to recognize is you need to get in touch with your own inner mentor for others. because it is there. We look at dozens of applications for people to come to the colloquium with NSF support every year. And there have been a few of them that have really stood out in my mind. One was a guy named Kevin Renner, who is a graduate student. I mean, his advisor was writing that he was mentoring the other graduate students. And you know, most graduate students will tell you it's a really tough environment, very competitive and so on, and you just felt nervous. But he was helping people all around him. And we took him, he's now on the Senate Finance Committee staff, after being on the Senate Energy and Natural Resources staff, after being an AMS Congressional Science Fellow and so on. Paulette remembers him, I think Renee and Keith maybe remember Kevin Renner as well. But I mean, there are people, you can do this, you can do it early. And it just has it sends an entirely different message to yourself about who you are. Instead of saying to myself, I'm a needy person, you're saying, I have something to give, going back to Mo Siegel and his commencement address. You know, I'm a go-giver, you know, and that's what I do. I don't care whether I go hungry or not. I'm in the business of giving as long as I have a breath to do it. So other comments about that, or about, I think, again, you've got a whole career ahead of you, and the career is made up of little daily choices. You know, and you and I can sit there every day and think of a reason to be stressed or tense or fearful. And the next day, it'll be a little easier to make that choice. So I'm going to tell one other story about growing up, which may help with this same process. So how many of you, well, let me put it this way. I was 16 when I learned how to swim. Anybody else that old when they learned how to swim? A couple of hands. Most people, you learn so young that you can't even remember. Okay, so I was my current height. I weighed 143 pounds, which is about 30 pounds less than I weigh now. So 143 pounds, we knew the Hookes had a skeleton in their closet, but we didn't realize they were educating it, you know, that kind of thing. And I was going to a college that had a swimming test. And so it was time. So they threw me in the pool, and what did they say to me? Oh, no, that's grim. What they said to me, was, relax. Okay. And I knew that was the one thing I must not do. So I thrashed around and I would sink like a stone. But you're all grinning. And then one day, despite my best efforts, I relaxed. And then everything changes, doesn't it? So I want you to remember, the next time, develop a sensitivity to, you know, when is it that you're starting to get stressed? And sort of then try to remember the swimming analogy, and you can coach yourself into being, you know, a little more relaxed. And it's a reminder, by the way, it's not the key to being slightly more effective. It's the key in swimming and in life to being radically more effective. And the whole thing in leadership is about, you know, you all read when you were kids about sailing ships that would round Cape Horn, you know, and they always had the big waves through there because there was just an unlimited fetch, and the waves would be higher than the ship, and some of the rigging would be torn off, and a mast or two might be gone. And the function of the captain in that setting is to show up, you know, on deck and say, what a great morning for a stroll. Okay, doesn't have to do with fixing anything, it just has to do with remaining, you know, having a perspective, a slightly larger perspective on that context. Your whole career doing climate science, you know, there's going to be people who are going to see all sorts of urgent problems associated with the way local and regional and larger scale climate is affecting their livelihood and their prospects and all the rest of it. They're going to be looking to you and me and other people, first of all, to be embedded in their circumstance and sharing, so dealing with the problems locally. And secondly, manifesting some calm and some ability to deal with the problem. That's probably a good enough note to kind of let people manifest some calm and get some rest. So, thank you for letting me be part of